Maps don't usually lie, but sometimes they forget. Between the 1600s and the 1800s, European cartographers labelled a massive territory across northern Asia with a single word: Tartary. Not a footnote, not speculation, but thousands of square miles marked with the confidence reserved for France or Spain. Then, within a remarkably narrow window of time, it vanished from the maps entirely. I started tracking this disappearance the way you'd investigate a deleted photograph. The older the map, the more prominent the label. Guillaume de Lisle's 1757 map shows Tartary sprawling across Central Asia with the same cartographic certainty as any European kingdom. Nikolai Fischer's 1657 version stretches the designation even further, covering territory from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. These weren't amateur sketches. These were official maps used for trade routes, military planning, diplomatic negotiations. Maps that governments and merchants staked their fortunes on. By 1850, the label starts fragmenting. Great Tartary becomes Russian territory. Chinese Tartary gets absorbed into Qing Empire classifications. Independent Tartary simply disappears, replaced by smaller regional designations or left blank. The speed of this cartographic erasure feels wrong, like watching a country, size of Europe, get divided up and renamed in the span of a few decades, without any major war or conquest explaining the change. What makes this stranger is that the architecture remained. Massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, and Mongolia that showcase construction techniques historians struggle to attribute to the civilizations we're told built them. Buildings featuring identical proportion systems, similar decorative mathematics, and engineering sophistication that appears simultaneously across thousands of miles. You'd expect this kind of architectural consistency from a unified civilization, but we're told these were built by scattered groups with minimal contact. The conventional explanation offers us a simple answer. Tartary was never a real place. It was just a catch-all term Europeans used for regions they didn't understand, a cartographic placeholder for here be dragons. But that explanation requires believing that professional cartographers, the same ones who accurately mapped coastlines and trade routes, suddenly became vague and imprecise when dealing with the largest landmass on their charts. That they drew borders, marked cities, indicated governmental centres, all for something that supposedly didn't exist as any kind of cohesive entity. Here's what troubles me about accepting that narrative. If Tartary was merely a European label slapped onto unknown territory, why do Russians' imperial records reference it as a distinct region with specific administrative structures? Why do Chinese sources acknowledge interactions with Tartar populations in ways that suggest organized societies rather than nomadic tribes? The documentation exists in multiple languages, from multiple perspectives, describing something more substantial than cartographic confusion. Then there's the timing. The period when Tartary disappears from maps coincides almost exactly with a wave of architectural standardization across Europe and Asia. Between 1750 and 1850, government buildings, administrative centres, and palaces start showing remarkably similar design principles. The same mathematical proportions, the same construction techniques, the same architectural language appearing in St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Beijing within decades of each other. The official history credits this to neoclassical revival, to travelling architects sharing ideas, to the natural spread of aesthetic trends. But architectural knowledge doesn't typically transfer that quickly or that uniformly, especially across rival empires that were supposedly competing for dominance. Unless these weren't rivals at all, unless there was a common architectural tradition they were all drawing from, a shared knowledge base that predated their official founding dates. Look at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. The fairgrounds featured elaborate buildings with classical proportions, ornate detailing, and engineering that seemed impossibly sophisticated for temporary structures. The Tower of Jewels stood 435 feet tall, covered with over 100,000 glass ornaments. We're told these were built in months, then demolished within a year. Temporary plaster and wood designed for quick assembly. But photographs from the period show something that doesn't match that explanation. The scale, the precision, the level of detail in structures supposedly destined for demolition. Early photography required long exposure times, which is why the streets often appear empty, but the buildings themselves display a permanence that contradicts their temporary purpose. The contrast between the muddy streets, with horse-drawn carts, and the towering architectural achievements creates a visual disconnect that's hard to reconcile. This pattern repeats across World's fairs and expositions throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. Chicago, 1893. Paris, 1889. Buildings of extraordinary sophistication erected rapidly, then destroyed. The official records document construction timelines and architectural plans. Yet something about the photographic evidence suggests these weren't new buildings at all, but rather existing structures being repurposed, cleaned up, and presented as recent achievements. The theory that emerges from this evidence claims these buildings were inherited from Tartary, that the expositions were showcasing existing architecture under the guise of modern construction. That sounds absurd until you start counting the buildings that survived demolition orders, until you notice how many temporary structures became permanent fixtures, until you examine the construction photographs and realize they show restoration work more than new building. What did Tartary actually look like before the maps changed? The architectural evidence suggests something far more sophisticated than scattered nomadic groups. The cartographic record indicates something substantial enough that multiple European powers documented it consistently across centuries. And the speed with which it vanished from official history suggests something that needed to be forgotten. But forgotten why? That question leads somewhere even stranger. Consider the fires, not metaphorically, literally. Between 1750 and 1850, an unusual number of major fires destroyed government archives, royal palaces, and administrative buildings across Europe and Asia. The Royal Palace in Madrid burned in 1734. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg suffered fires in 1837. The Library of Congress in 1814. London's Palace of Westminster in 1834. Each time, irreplaceable historical records vanished. Each time, the reconstruction introduced new architectural standards. Each time, the official narrative shifted slightly. Fire is convenient that way. It destroys documentation while creating opportunities for revision. And if you were trying to erase evidence of a previous civilization while claiming its architecture as your own, selective fires would accomplish both objectives efficiently. Not suggesting deliberate arson necessarily, but noting that the pattern of what burned and when it burned aligns remarkably well with the period when Tartary was disappearing from maps. The reconstruction efforts following these fires showed suspicious uniformity. Buildings across different empires adopted similar proportions, similar engineering principles, similar decorative elements. The official explanation credits architectural movements, the spread of neoclassical ideals, the influence of specific architects whose names appear in later documentation, but whose training often traces back to institutions with incomplete records. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation suggests these weren't new designs being invented, but old designs being copied. That the architects weren't creating, but remembering, working from templates that predated their supposed innovation. Look at the construction timelines. The US Capitol begun in 1793. The British Museum started in 1753. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, constructed between 1754 and 1762. All supposedly built by societies that had recently emerged from what we're told were less sophisticated periods. All demonstrating engineering knowledge that required generations to develop, appearing within decades of each other. The labour question never gets satisfactory answers either. These weren't small projects. Moving the stone alone required massive coordinated efforts. The official histories credit armies of workers, advanced pulley systems, careful planning, but the photographs from later construction projects using supposedly similar techniques show something different. They show struggle, show improvisation, show engineers trying to figure out how the older buildings were actually constructed, as if the knowledge had been lost. Involves urban development, streets being raised to improve drainage or accommodate infrastructure. Reasonable enough for one building, one street, one city. But when you find the same pattern in San Francisco, New York, Moscow, London, Paris, cities that supposedly developed independently under different administrations with different priorities, the explanation starts requiring more coincidence than seems plausible. The timing matches exactly. These basement conversions cluster in the mid to late 1800s, the same period when Tartary vanishes, the same period when those convenient fires destroyed so many records, the same period when photography was just becoming common enough to document what existed, but not common enough to have documented what came before. A perfect window for revision, for claiming inheritance while obscuring origin. What actually happened in that window? The official timeline describes industrialization, empire building, the spread of Western civilization. But industrialization typically produces functional architecture, not ornate classical proportions. Empire building typically imposes the victor's style, not adopts the conquered's aesthetic. And Western civilization supposedly spread from Europe outward. Yet many of the most sophisticated examples of this architecture appear in regions that were allegedly primitive before European contact. Russian expansion into Siberia provides a case study. The official narrative describes Cossacks gradually pushing eastward, encountering scattered nomadic tribes, establishing outposts that grew into cities. Straightforward colonization. Except the Russian chronicles from the period describe something else. They describe encountering established settlements, stone structures, organized populations, not primitive camps but functioning urban centers. Those descriptions don't appear in modern textbooks. They exist in archives, mentioned briefly, then contextualized away as exaggeration or misidentification. Why would Russian explorers exaggerate finding civilization? If anything, claiming to have conquered empty wilderness makes the achievement more impressive, suggests bringing order to chaos. Admitting that sophisticated societies already existed raises uncomfortable questions about what happened to them and why their existence isn't acknowledged in the subsequent historical narrative. The linguistic evidence compounds the mystery. Across Central Asia, place names share common roots that don't match any currently recognized language family. Scholars categorize them as ancient Turkic or Proto-Mongolian, terms that acknowledge similarity without explaining origin. But what if these names weren't ancient relics but recent remnants? What if the language they derived from was still being spoken when the maps changed, then systematically replaced with Russian, Chinese, or other imperial languages as the territories were absorbed? You can watch this process happening in real time through historical documents. Early Russian administrative records from Siberia use local terminology. Within decades, those terms disappear, replaced with Russian equivalents, not through gradual evolution, but through deliberate substitution. Official orders mandating new names, new classifications, new ways of describing the same geographic features. Standard imperial practice perhaps, but thorough enough that within 2 generations the original names were forgotten, even by local populations. The architectural heritage tells a different story than the linguistic erasure. Buildings don't forget their proportions. The mathematics embedded in their construction persists, regardless of what you call them. And those mathematical principles, when you analyze them, reveal knowledge that shouldn't exist in isolation. They demonstrate understanding of harmonic ratios, of structural load distribution, of acoustic engineering principles that wouldn't be formally codified until much later. Yet there they are, built into structures supposedly erected by societies without that theoretical framework. Which brings us back to the royal bloodlines. Because someone had to commission these buildings, someone had to possess both the resources and the knowledge to demand specific proportions, specific engineering solutions. And if that someone wasn't the dynasty currently claiming credit, then who were they? The genealogical records provide clues. When you trace European royal marriages backward from 1850, you encounter women whose documented ancestry stops abruptly around 1650 to 1700. Not through missing records, through records that were never comprehensive to begin with. These weren't minor nobles whose families kept poor documentation. These were women marrying into the most thoroughly documented bloodlines in human history. Yet their own lineages remain curiously vague. Official explanations cite small German principalities, minor nobility, distant cousins, but when you attempt to verify these claims through independent sources, the documentation becomes circular. One genealogy references another, which references the first. No primary sources, no birth records, no estate documents that would normally accompany nobility of any rank. Just names and dates that appear fully formed, as if written backward from the marriage itself. The timing matters. These genealogical gaps cluster precisely when the maps were changing, when Tartary was vanishing from cartographic record, when massive architectural projects were being attributed to dynasties whose own origins were being solidified. It's not that documentation was lost, it's that certain connections were never meant to be documented clearly in the first place. Look at what happened to Siberian populations during Russian expansion. The early chronicles describe encounters with established settlements, organized societies, populations that possessed metallurgical knowledge and construction capabilities. Then those descriptions fade, replaced by narratives of primitive tribes, nomadic peoples, territories awaiting civilization. The transformation happens in written record faster than demographics could shift through natural processes. Where did those earlier populations go? The official history suggests assimilation, gradual integration into Russian society. But assimilation typically leaves traces, cultural practices that persist, linguistic influences, genetic markers in modern populations. Siberia shows remarkably little of this continuity, as if the earlier inhabitants weren't assimilated but replaced entirely, or perhaps reclassified so thoroughly that their previous identity became unrecoverable. The architectural evidence contradicts the narrative of primitive populations awaiting development. Stone structures across Central Asia demonstrate construction knowledge that couldn't have emerged spontaneously. These techniques required generations of accumulated experience, institutional knowledge passed through formal training. You don't build arched doorways 12 feet high without understanding structural mechanics. You don't create harmonic proportions without mathematical sophistication. Yet we're asked to believe these capabilities appeared, built a few structures, then vanished without leaving institutional framework behind. No schools, no guilds, no succession of master builders, just isolated monuments attributed to various conquering empires, each supposedly inventing similar solutions independently. The royal bloodlines become more significant when you consider who controlled access to these territories. If Siberia and Central Asia contained sophisticated populations before Russian expansion, then someone governed those populations. Someone organized construction projects, maintained trade networks, administered territories large enough to appear on European maps as distinct political entities. Those administrators would have left descendants, families with claims to territory, with knowledge of governance systems, with architectural and engineering expertise, families that conquering powers would need to either eliminate or absorb. And if absorption was the strategy, if these families were integrated rather than destroyed, then their bloodlines would persist within the conquering dynasties. But acknowledging that integration would require acknowledging what was being integrated, It would require admitting these territories weren't empty wilderness, but functioning societies. It would raise questions about the legitimacy of claims based on discovering and civilizing primitive lands. So the genealogies were simplified. Maternal lines were documented vaguely. Origins were attributed to minor German nobility rather than Central Asian governance families. The architecture was credited to imported European genius rather than inherited local knowledge, and the populations themselves were reclassified as primitive, their previous sophistication erased from official record. The fires that destroyed genealogical archives weren't random. They occurred at moments when verification would have been most problematic, when challenges to newly established bloodlines were most likely. After each fire, the reconstructed records favoured the current power structure, eliminating contradictions, smoothing transitions, creating cleaner narratives than the messy reality of conquest and absorption. What we're left with is architecture that speaks a language its supposed builders never learned, proportions that suggest occupants of different scale, engineering principles that appeared fully formed without documented development, and royal families whose maternal lines trace back to convenient obscurity just when verification would reveal inconvenient truths. This isn't about proving a lost empire. It's about recognizing that the official narrative requires accepting too many convenient gaps, too many systematic erasures, too many architectural impossibilities attributed to primitive peoples who allegedly possess no institutional knowledge. The buildings remain because stone doesn't forget. The proportions persist because mathematics doesn't change with political boundaries. And the questions accumulate because gaps in documentation create their own evidence, negative space that reveals what was deliberately left unrecorded. Who commissioned structures requiring knowledge of harmonic ratios before such knowledge was formally codified? Who possessed resources to build at continental scale using consistent engineering principles? Who governed territories large enough to appear on maps as distinct political entities, then vanish so completely that their existence became deniable? The genealogical silence suggests an answer that conventional history can't accommodate, that the royal bloodlines we're shown represent carefully curated narratives, strategic marriages that obscured rather than revealed actual ancestry, integration disguised as isolated dynastic accidents. The architecture tells us someone was here. The maps confirm they governed territory. The genealogies stop exactly where confirmation would become problematic. And we're asked to accept this as normal historical erosion rather than systematic obscuration. The buildings remember what the bloodlines were meant to forget. Stand in front of any major government building from the 1700s or 1800s. Really look at it. Notice the doorways sized for occupants who don't exist anymore. Notice the mathematical precision in proportions that supposedly emerged without formal training. Notice how the official construction dates coincide exactly with the period when Tartary was vanishing from maps and convenient fires were destroying genealogical records. The story we've been given requires accepting that scattered primitive peoples independently developed identical architectural languages across thousands of miles. That sophisticated engineering appeared without institutional development, that royal families married women whose ancestry stopped being traceable exactly when verification would challenge official narratives, that an entire civilization's worth of territory simply changed labels on maps, without any major conflict explaining the transition. The architecture doesn't lie, the proportions don't change with political boundaries, and the systematic gaps in documentation create their own testimony about what someone decided we shouldn't remember. The question isn't whether something was here before. The buildings prove that conclusively. The question is why proving it has become impossible, and what else disappeared along with the maps that once showed us exactly where to look.